So this is a common example of needing to do loops in VBA. So what we have is some data that's been exported. We have first name, last name, the office a sales associate works in, and then each their total sales for quarters 1, 2, 3, and 4. What we want, however, so that we can do some analysis of our employees, is a table that looks like this. We want all of their information on one row instead of on multiple rows, so that we can make a pivot table out of it. We want their name, their office, their total sales in one column, and their average sales in another. So we need to make a function that will go through each of these chunks of information here one at a time, grab all that information, calculate it, and print it out over here. So with a loop, we need to keep track of two things every time we go through a loop. First, we need to keep track of which record set we're on. Is it this record set, this one, or the next one? Also, we need to keep track of which row we're outputting to. So the first time through, we're outputting to row 2, and the second time we need to output to row 3, and so forth. And those are two different numbers. Sometimes you may have non-uniformity in the data that's been exported. So for example, right now we have a space in between each of these. Well, some of them might have one space and others might have two spaces between them. So we can't simply say, well, add 9 each time we go through the loop, and that'll move us from row 1 to row, well, add 8. That'll move us from row 1 to row 8. So we have to think through how to handle this. Let's go ahead and create a sub. So hit Alt F11, or if you're on a Mac, Command Shift I or something like, well, no, I don't remember. Open up your VBA editor. And let's go ahead and insert a module into this workbook to work on. So insert module. This is where we're going to put our code. So I'm going to move this window down. Let's always start off by putting Option explicit at the top, so that our program uses as little memory as possible. Let's make a sub, and we'll call it batch practice. Okay. Alright, so I said we need to keep track of where we're starting and where we're finishing. Now there's two ways of going about this. We can keep track of our locations using absolute references or relative references. And what I mean is, let me come back here. We can click our cursor in cell A1, and then each time through the loop, actually move the cursor to the next record set each time we go through. In that case, we could write a sub that simply says, well, I'll come back to that. Or we can leave our cursor wherever it is, and simply refer to the information each time in memory without actually moving the cursor. So either way is going to be okay, and you should probably learn both ways. Moving the cursor makes it take longer. However, that makes it a bit easier to use relative references. So let's use relative references when we gather the input, and let's use absolute references when we paste our output, just so you can see both ways. And you can use either one. Alright, so I'm going to start by keeping track of the output row, O row. Which row do we want to print out the output to each time? I'm going to make this an integer, since it's going to represent the number of the row we're printing out to. And then I need to initialize it. O row is going to equal, let's look back here and see, if we have the title on row 1, and the first bit of data starts on row 2. So let's initialize O row to row 2. Okay, we also have some processing to do. As we look back here, we need to take quarters 1 through 4, total them up, and calculate the average. So there are shortcuts to this, but I'm going to not take any shortcuts, do it sort of the long way. And I'm going to create a variable for name, office, and then one for each of quarters 1 through 4. Okay, so I'm going to dim name as string, office as string, and just to make this easy to read, I'm going to put my quarters on another line. Quarter 1 as, now since these can have decimals, they represent money, I'm going to use currency. 2 as currency, 3 as currency, and 4 as currency. So first step is collect my inputs, and that's what I've done here. I've created variables to represent my inputs, but I'm not going to collect them until I enter inside of the loop, because the inputs are going to change each time we loop through a batch of data. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our loop next. So we could actually, in this case, well, let's see. Since we have spaces in between each section of data, I think it's going to be easier to use a do loop than a for loop. Again, a for loop we use when we know beforehand exactly how many times it's going to loop. And you may have seen some examples in class how to say for x equals 1, 2, and then do a control n down and see where the last row is. That control down isn't going to work with these spaces. If none of that made sense to you, don't worry about it a bit. We're just going to use a do loop. So I'm going to actually move my cursor one chunk of data at a time from here to here each time I go through the loop. And I want to keep looping through until my cursor finds a spot that doesn't have any information to it. In particular, here's our last record. When I get here, I'm going to hit control down and then control down again, and I'm going to get to the very last row in the workbook where there's no data. So I want to end the loop when whatever the selected cell is no longer has data in it. So back here I'm going to say do until is, and there's a function called is empty, and because this is a function, I pass in a parameter. I pass in the cell object to check to see if it's empty or not. I'm going to say selection. Selection.value would work as well, but we actually don't need a value in this case. So it says go until the cursor is placed in the spot where there's nothing in the cell. So if we want this to work every time, we better start by putting our cursor at the very beginning. Notice we haven't done that yet. So far, we've created variables and we've set up a control structure, but we haven't run the method to move the cursor to the right spot at the beginning. So anywhere before this loop, I'm simply going to say range a1 dot select. Now, just in case I happen to run this when a different sheet is selected, I may also want to select the proper worksheet first before I select the cell, just to make sure I'm always in the right spot. So let's see what the name of the sheet is. It is batch. So, no problem. Sheet batch dot select. Okay, so this ensures that our cursor will be in the right place to begin the loop, so that the first time we go through it doesn't already think it's empty. Okay, so what we need to do next before we do anything else is increment this loop, or tell it how to move to the next spot to check and see if the next spot is empty. First time through, our cursor is going to be placed. Actually, let's run it and see. Notice my cursor is here on cell A1068. But before I run it, I need to make sure that I don't enter into this loop yet. Because the loop hasn't been incremented, it'll turn into an infinite loop. So I'm going to pause this on this line so it doesn't begin the loop. So now I'm going to go ahead and hit play. Okay, notice that in my locals window, it's pulled up each of my variables I've created. Over here, my cursor is now in cell A1. Let me move it and do it one more time so you can see. So stop, run this again. Okay, go back to my sheet. My cursor is now in A1, cell A1, even though I moved it. Okay, so that seems to be working just fine. Let's stop right there. So now that we know our cursor is going to be in A1, when the loop begins, we'll know exactly how to move to the next spot. So there's lots of ways. I could say, okay, I simply want to go and refer to the active cell and say let's offset 9 rows down, 0 columns over, and select that spot. Okay, let's run this one time so you can see what happens if I do this. Okay, so let's move this window over. I'm going to put my cursor over here, and then I'm going to hit F8 or Command-Shift-I if you're in a Mac to step through my my sub. So I set up ORow, initialize it, select the right sheet, and select the right cell. Is that empty? No, it's not. Therefore, it's going to enter this loop. It says, okay, active cell, which is A1, dot offset, which means go down 9 rows, select. So move the cursor 9 rows down. Oh, and I actually miscounted. That actually moves me down, because I went down 9 rows, that moved me to row 10. So let me stop it right there. Let's change this to 8 rows down. Let's step through again, F8. Select the right location, A1. I enter the loop. It moves down 9 spots. Great. Okay, that's fine. So I loop again. I go to the next spot. It says, is that empty? No, it's not. Therefore, move down 8 more cells. Okay, no problem. I move down to this next spot. So this is the way my loop is working. I'm going down 8 rows at a time. And this would work perfectly fine to increment through the loop. Eventually, notice if I just hold down F8, it's just going to keep going, and it's going to keep moving my cursor. And then eventually, okay, look, I've gotten to the spot here, row 81, where there's 2 spaces between this chunk of data and the next. And so it says, now it's going to say, okay, 81, is it, oh, I let me start over, my mistake. I exited out of it. Okay. All right, next to the loop, it says, okay, do this until it's empty. Well, the selection is empty, which means it's going to skip entering inside that loop now and ignore this, which it does, and goes to the end of the function, and it's going to miss all of the data after that point. Okay, we don't want that to happen. So we need to find a different way to increment through this loop that will account for all of these double spaces without us having to go through and manually delete each of the double spaces one at a time. Okay, so one way to do that is to simply place our cursor back up the top, and instead of saying always move 8 rows down, simply hit Control down. Which we do that by saying active cell.end, XL down, and we actually need to hit Control down twice, .end, XL down. The reason why we need to do that twice, what this is going to do, let me stretch this out for you now, is this is going to say, okay, instead of just moving down 8 cells, I want you to hold the Control button and then hit the down arrow twice. That's what this end XL down means. It's the equivalent of putting my cursor here and saying, holding down Control and then hitting down arrow once takes me to the end of that range of data. Twice takes me to the beginning of the next range of data it finds. So again, 1 to the end of that data, and then twice we'll skip all blank cells until it finds the beginning of the next range of data. So this appears like something that'll work for our case. Let's go, let's run this again with this code. This time though, I'm just keep using F8 to step through. So I'm moving chunk at a time, seems to be working fine. I get down to this spot with 2 rows and it moves flawlessly down to the next spot. So this will work for us to increment our loop. And let me label this because people often forget what I'm doing here. This increments the, and I'm going to call it the loop input data. Okay, we also need to keep track of, though, where we're going to be printing off and printing out the information we take in. So we're going to be keeping track and incrementing that separately. But for now, let's go back to our input processing output model. Now notice the overall sub follows some inputs, processing and output will both be inside the loop. But inside the loop, what we do is we take the pieces of that model, the initializing, the second half of collecting the inputs, initializing the variables, and then processing and output, and we put all that inside the loop because we need to do it differently for each of these chunks of data. So we're going to start now continue by grabbing the input data. Let me move this down so you can see. All right, I'm going to say now take name, office, and quarters 1 through 4 and set them equal to the values here in this first chunk of data. So let me stop this and start running again. So each time we run, remember our cursor is going to be placed in cell A1. So now we can say, all right, their name is going to be equal to Ann Hannah. It's always going to be 1 cell over for the first name, and then we're going to add a space, then concatenate on 1 cell over, 1 cell down for the second name. So name is going to be equal to, and we're going to use what's called a relative reference here. So relative to the currently selected cell, we want to grab the value in the cell next to it. So we're going to say active cell dot offset, which lets us then say, okay, how many rows down is the first name? It's 0 rows down. How many columns over is the first name? It's 1 column over. That's where we get and from. And we need dot value out of that. So active cell dot off cell dot value. And then I'm going to, so you can see all of this on one line. Instead of putting this string concatenation all on one line, I'm going to enter down a line and say name equals name ampersand. I'm going to add a space. Open, close. Remember, everything in between the parentheses is what we're concatenating onto this. And all I have is a single space, which means now name equals, here it says name is going to equal the name Ann. And then this line says name is going to be equal to Ann plus a space after it. That's why I have name equals name plus, or name and. So I'm going to do that once again, name equals name ampersand active cell dot offset. Now, in this case, think for a second, where do I go to get the last name? Okay, you might make the mistake of thinking, well, we got the first name from cell B1, now we want to go down 1 row and across 0 rows. Okay, that's actually a mistake. So the active cell at this point is still A1. Remember, there's no dot select up here. We didn't actually move the cursor. All we did was say, give us the value out of the cell next to it. Remember, value is a property and not a method. So down here, active cell is still A1, which means that to get the last name, we do need to go down 1 row, but also still over 1 column. Dot value. Okay, now pay attention. I'm going to get rid of that immediate window. To this variable as we step through, as we continue stepping through. I'm going to hit F8, and on this line, after I hit F8 again, it's going to say name is now equal to, there it is, Ann. I grab the value in the cell next to it. F8 one more time. Now name is equal to Ann with a space between the E and that second parenthesis. One more time. Now it's equal to first name space last name. So we've collected the name. Alright, I'm going to hit stop right here. And now let's go back and collect the rest of our inputs. The office equal. Same way we got the name. Active cell is still A1. Cell, therefore the offset is going to be down 2 over 1 value. And then Q1 through 4, let's set those up. Q1 is going to equal, I'm going to start copying and pasting now. Down 3 rows over 1. Q2 equals down, just a second, Q3 equals that, Q4 equals that. Whoops. Now let's fix this. Q2 is going to be down 4 rows, 3, 5 rows, 4, 6 rows. Okay, let's give it some more room here in the locals window, and let's test this out and make sure we're collecting all the inputs properly. The F8, our cursor is moved to cell A1 like it should. Name gets built across 3 lines, that's correct. Office, yep, it's Provo. Q1, that's the right number, that's the right number, that's the right number. Okay, all of our inputs are being collected properly. Okay, so let's go ahead and label this as initialize input variables. Okay, next step, whoops. Now that we have all the inputs, we are going to need to do some processing to come up with total sales and average sales, as well as output the values to the output row. I'm going to do all of that in one step here to save us a bit of space. So I'm going to begin by outputting the name properly. Alright, so recall that we're still in the loop. We need to print out last name on row 2. I'm going to delete this for now. And then when we get to our next chunk of data, we need to output the name to row 3. We don't want to have 8 spaces in between each output entry. So to do that properly, we've got to keep track of which row we should be outputting to. Recall that's the purpose of this O row right here. So O row is represented by the number 2. So instead of using a relative reference like we do to collect the inputs, we're now going to use an absolute reference. So let me label this as perform processing and output results. Okay, so we want to stick the name in cell. The row is going to be equal to, now if I just type in the number 2 to represent row 2, and column, a name is going to be in column D, which is the fourth column, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I put a 4 right here. I can say cells, this basically means cells D2.value is going to be equal to name. Okay, let's try that and see what happens. So I'm going to stop this and then hit F8. F8, move into here, it selects A1, grabs name, grabs all the currencies the way it should, everything's moving right along. Cells 2, 4, now look, I just processed that. Cells D2.value now equals the name variable. That seems to work. I print it out in the right spot. However, the problem is, as I hit F8 again, and I move my input from this chunk of data down to this chunk, and then I go back into the loop again, it's not empty, so I continue. Now notice name is going to be equal to, now Luca, hold it out, Luca space, Elias, in the Linden office, all of his values are plugged in. What's the problem going to be? When I hit F8, it sticks Luca's name in the exact same spot. Well, that's not what I want. I want his name to appear on the next row down, so that I keep track of each chunk of information. So what we're going to have to do is instead of hard coding row 2 here, we need to use our variable O row. So O row represents the number 2. Okay, just by putting that in, see down here it says O row is equal to 2. Therefore, it's still going to put the first chunk of data in the exact same spot. If I do this, that's all well and good, but it doesn't actually fix my problem. Let me show you here. Put Dan Hannah in there, I go back in again, put Luca Eliason again. I'm still putting every name into row 2. What I need to do is I need to increment the output row. So I'm going to say this increments the loop, output data. And all I'm going to do is say take that variable O row and set it equal to O row plus 1. Add 1 each time to that variable O row, and then the next time it goes through the loop, this won't equal 2, it'll equal 3. Therefore, it'll print it out in row 3. So let me show you how that works. So, stop and restart, F8. We grab Ann Hannah's information, plug it in, prints her out. Oh, look what happened now. O row is now equal to row 3. Therefore, when I printed out Luke Elias's information, it printed out over here on row 3. Okay, as soon as I process these next 2 lines and this one, now O row is equal to 4. So the next time through the loop, this new name, Andre Ben, now gets printed out on cell D4 over here. So I increment it and I use a variable here to represent the row. That's how I make sure that each output data gets printed on consecutive rows. So again, this is called an absolute reference because I'm saying, okay, we don't care what the active cell is. I'm giving you the numbers directly. Even though I'm using a variable, I'm basically putting a number here and a number there to say, put this value into this cell regardless of what cell is selected. So this cells object ignores the currently active cell, thus making it an absolute reference. Okay, so we're handling the name just fine. In fact, if we just hit play and finish it out, look over here, you'll notice that all of the names are printed properly. Awesome. So let's add office to it. That's not so hard. Right here, I'm going to say cells, also O row, but instead of column D represented by that number 4, I want to print the office in column E, which is number 5. Dot value is going to equal office. That's this variable right here that we use to collect and store the name of the office. Okay, let's continue. Cells, O row. What goes in column 6? Well, let's take a look. Total sales goes in column 6. Okay, all we need to do, we already have each of the quarters stored in Q1 through 4. Let's just put Q1 plus Q2 plus Q3 plus Q4. Okay, now I'm going to copy this. In the last one, we need the average. So I'm going to take this and simply wrap parentheses around this and say divided by 4. Now the average will go in, whoops, column 7, column 6. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this function now. I don't like how my cursor ends here in cell A1,000,000 or whatever that is. So when this loop is all done, let's add something. Let's say go right back up to the top by putting in range A1.select in again. So after it's done with all the loops, it'll kick out of the loop and go to this line and move our cursor back up to the top. I'm going to run that one more time. There we go. So now notice over here we've got the name, office, total sales, average sales. Oh, I didn't format this properly, but that's alright. And our cursor is back up here. So there are many different variations. This function's done. This sub is done. And this you could turn this in for credit and you get full points for this. But this is only one of many different ways that this would have worked. There's a few other things we could have done. So for example, we could have performed the processing before we outputted the result. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to change this to output results only right here. And up here, perform processing by creating a couple other variables. Call them dim total as currency and average as currency. Okay, I'm going to use these variables for processing. And here I'm going to say total equals, grab all this, and then average. I don't have to recalculate the total. I can just use this variable called total, because after this line is executed, total will now be stored in this variable. So I can use that variable right here and just say average simply equals total divided by 4. That way, I'm only performing this addition one time instead of twice like I am down here. So here all I need to do now is replace this with total average. So now I'm doing processing separate from my outputting of the results. Play, run it, notice everything looks just the same. However, average sales is now correct because I've created average as a currency variable, and so it printed them out correctly. Okay, this is still not the only way to have done this. Something else I could have done is use, instead of a do until loop, I could have used a do while loop. So the difference between a do while and a do until is that a do until does something until a condition is true, and a do while does it while it's true, until it's false. So currently this says, is the selection empty? Well, before that was always evaluated as false. Well, this time is empty as false, which means that while is not going to run, so I'm going to have to change my condition here. Instead of doing while this is empty, I'm going to have to do while, simply say not is empty. So continue this loop while selection is not empty, if that makes sense. Hit play, runs again, all the information's still there. Actually, to prove it to be that, I better delete all this out. Now run it again. There we go. That's still not the only way to do this. I could say do while not, or do while active cell value not equal to null. It's another way of saying the exact same thing. Do while whatever's in there is not null. Since this is not null, this will be evaluated as true. Therefore, a do while will continue as long as it's true. Play, everything runs just fine.